So about the webinar, as the title suggests, we're going to be looking at best practice around reporting and managing sustainability performance across supply chains and projects. I lead a reporting and performance management tool for action sustainability that we've implemented with major UK and global infrastructure, construction and facilities management clients. A lot of the things I say will be applicable to other industries. By the end of this webinar, hopefully I'd have provided you with a definition of what is performance management, what is reporting, what the key benefits are of that, as well as some challenges that we've experienced to date. And finally, I'll be providing a framework with basic principles for managing performance. The way that we'll break down the webinar is, first of all, looking at the what. What are we talking about? What is sustainability performance management? What fits within its scope? Why? So why are businesses engaging, and why is it becoming a much more popular item on the agenda of sustainability? And finally, we'll look at that framework that I mentioned of how do we do it, how do we implement it effectively. And depending on your organization, you might see it from different perspectives. The way we like to frame it is in 4 key steps that are all complementary of each other and all constitute performance management. The first key step is the planning, the intention part, and that's part and parcel of managing performance. If you haven't planned properly, if you haven't laid out your intention, then you won't be able to manage performance effectively. This actually reflects some of the guidance that's provided by ISO 2400 around managing sustainability within your supply chain, which I encourage you to look at online. The planning phase really constitutes making sure that as an organization, whether it's looking at a project or your supply chain, that you've defined what it is you're trying to get out of managing your performance. So essentially, why are you doing it? What are your audacious goals around managing performance? And that's laying out the intention. The second phase is around measuring. It's the collection of information. Typically, it's data, right, that's reported by various entities, whether it's individuals within your organization, business units, or it could be suppliers that are reporting. And that's where you're collecting the information, the hard empirical evidence that you need to manage performance effectively. The third step is reporting, the redaction stage. Typically, that's in the shape of taking a snapshot at a singular time of the data that you've collected, and that tends to have an analysis part that's associated with it. And then finally, once you've done all those 3 steps, you've defined what you want to do, you've collected the data, you've redacted it, made it into digestible format, you can then take action, right? And that 4th step is actually managing the progress, and that's a bit more of a hands-on part of the process for many organizations, particularly when you're working with your supply chain, who will be doing steps 2 and 3 for you potentially. We think that all these 4 things need to be together for effective performance management. However, some organizations might be at different stages of their evolution in terms of where they're at with managing performance, and so maybe only doing a couple of those. To sort of frame as well the conversation, I like to think that managing sustainability performance and reporting is applicable across the board, right? Just in terms of sustainability. So just to clarify, we're taking that 3 pillars approach of sustainability, where we have the environment, the social aspects, and the economic aspects that are combined. We're seeing, particularly in our experience, that organizations are asking their projects or their supply chains to report sustainability under a really large umbrella of issues. We can see on the right-hand side of the screen there, a word cloud of various sustainability issues that might be reported. What we're seeing in terms of the most, I guess, popular areas of reporting and performance management, obviously one being carbon, because organizations are trying to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. We're seeing reporting against health and safety. health and safety and waste, actually, they've been, I guess, more widely reported against for some time now, because of regulation, because governments around the world have enforced that type of information to be reported. One last interesting one that I wanted to mention is social value. Now, this is an interesting trend that we're seeing in the UK, whereby organizations are reporting some of their community-based efforts and employee-based efforts, and they're monetizing that under a framework for social value, whereby they're monetizing the impacts that their activities are having on the community. What I just described there is sort of, in terms of an organization, what constitutes performance management. Very briefly, I'll go into more detail afterwards. And also it's, what falls under its umbrella in terms of sustainability issues. The other way we can look at it as well is, where do we manage sustainability, and where is reporting happening across organizations in our supply chain? First of all, there's an increasing amount of reporting and performance management that's happening at corporate levels. In its most popular formats, we're seeing more and more organizations, initially large organizations, but even medium-sized organizations doing so now, and they're publishing annual sustainability reports in parallel to their financial reports that might be making publicly available. Obviously, there's a part of communication that's around that, but a lot of it is also to do with making sure that you're keeping your stakeholders informed and keeping yourselves as organizations accountable against some targets that you might have set around sustainability. Organizations, when they do this, they typically report them on an annual basis, and then some of them will also align these reports and align some of the data that they're publicly publishing with key frameworks that are in use across the world. Examples of two popular ones there: the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So many organizations, particularly the large ones, will align goals against the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and they'll publish annual reports that really are showing and benchmarking how well they're doing against those goals. There are other frameworks. There's the UN PRIs, Principles for Responsible Investments, the UN Global Reporting Initiative, etc. The list goes on. There are many indices. We'll see sort of investor indices that are specific to various industries, and organizations are reporting against those because that attracts investors and enables them to access certain investment channels. And also sometimes they're under regulation they're obliged to report against those. If we step down from a corporate level that, as I've said, is typically reported on an annual basis, we're also seeing organizations that are reporting against specific projects. This I've seen in the construction industry quite a lot, in infrastructure industry quite a lot. Really, the reporting there tends to happen. There's reporting that happens before and reporting that happens after. So it's sort of a before snapshot and an after snapshot to try and sort of show the difference that a project has made on the environment or the community at large. Often, some of these projects are reporting because of permit requirements. There might be the local authorities are imposing these as part of permits for construction or for accessing a market, etc. And then we also see that quite often, projects are aligned to certain certifications, and they're trying to sort of get that stamp. And part of getting that stamp is reporting and managing your performance. Finally, if we sort of go down a further level, we're seeing that organizations are managing their performance and reporting across their supply chains. That can take sort of various shapes and forms. The most popular one, and the one that we recommend, is frequent reporting. If you're asking your supply chain to provide their information, their sustainability information to you based on the activities that they're doing for you as an organization, we recommend that is frequent reporting, maybe monthly or biannually. There are also annual audits that constitute performance management. And finally, why is this occurring? Well, more often than not, the end client will have that as a contractual obligation that they want sustainability data to be reported from downstream, upstream. Now I just want to explore sort of why, from an organization's perspective, would you want to manage your sustainability performance and across your own activities in your supply chain. We did with our clients some research and saw that these were four key aspects that are driving them to do this. First of all, there's value creation. Written some pointers there around reputation and competitive differentiation. Again, that's applicable to why would you want to be a more sustainable business. What we're observing is that there's more and more of an emphasis in tenders and in winning business. There's more and more of an emphasis on sustainability criteria. So, is the business I'm buying from sustainable, and are they trying to do their best? And those typically are the businesses that are winning market share. There are reports around investors that are saying that the businesses that are more sustainable, that score higher on sustainability indices, outperform the others financially. So it definitely seems that there's a parallel there between how well you're managing your sustainability performance and the value that your organization creates. I discussed it earlier on. There's the risk management aspect of making sure that your business is resilient, and that's seen as really a key issue. There's efficiency gains that can be made through effective performance management. If I take my experiences in working with construction and infrastructure markets, industries, sorry, we can definitely see that as organizations, report on their energy, they're becoming more aware of their energy consumption, and therefore they become aware of hotspots of energy consumption, and as a result, they know where they can reduce, and that's leading to cost efficiencies. So there's definitely there's a perception often that sustainability is costly and that it has to be an extra effort that's going to impact your bottom line, but actually, well, negatively, but actually, the reality is that there are many things that you can do to reduce your costs and to positively impact your business bottom line. The only thing that underpins that is making sure that you know what your baseline is and understanding where your inefficiencies exist. So without reporting, you're unable to do that. And finally, we're also seeing that organizations want to be innovative. They want to take a proactive approach to sustainability and to reporting, because they want to find new ways of doing business, new ways of engaging with their supply chains, and that leads to innovation. And ultimately, that sort of links back to value creation. A few sort of key tips that we propose to our clients. One is determine your baseline. Whenever you're trying to manage your sustainability performance, data is key, and therefore try to understand where do you stand today, so then you can know whether you're having a real impact or not. Too often we're seeing organizations committing to sustainability objectives without really understanding where they're at today, and they commit to them, they publicly commit to these sustainability objectives, and then they're not able to meet them for whatever reason. Had they had their baseline, they would have probably been able to sort of offer more realistic sustainability objectives. Second, I've mentioned it a few times already, is establishing reporting frequency. This will be determined by the context of your project. If it's a 2-year project, let's say, then you might want to do so every month, etc. When you're managing your supply chain, we really encourage you to keep sort of very close tabs on your suppliers. The more frequently you ask them to report, the more accountable they will become for the actions and the impact that they're having, and also the more you'll have an opportunity to address some potential issues that you identify. Obviously, reporting too frequently can become a hindrance as well and can become quite costly. So you need to balance those things out. I've mentioned exploring tools and resources to support the process. Make sure that you've got that you've explored all the existing tools that are out there. We've seen spreadsheets being used too many times, and spreadsheets are sort of relatively inefficient ways of reporting data up to, getting the data reported from your supply chains and vice versa. And try and implement tools that sort of minimize human error, because that can cause quite a lot of issues when you're trying to manage your performance and the data you're collecting is wrongly input. One way of managing that risk is through audits, through regular audits of your suppliers or your project workers. Depending on the context of a project, the frequency will need to be determined as well, and how do you identify which parts of your supply chain to audit. We really recommend that you undergo sort of risk analysis, right, to try and identify hotspots for potential risk areas and audit those in terms of priority. Defining your stakeholders is really important. That's extremely important when you're working with your supply chain, because you need to understand who it is that you're trying to have a positive impact with, and think how many tiers down the supply chain you want to go down, and you sort of want to put pressure on, and you want to push that sustainability accountability onto. Likewise, also think about the stakeholders that are going to be looking at the information that you'll be disclosing potentially. If it's investors or if it's the wider, public at large, that will impact how you want to report and what type of data you might want to collect for your performance management. Making reporting contractual is really important in terms of asking your supply chain to report data to enable you to have a full picture of your sustainability impact. We always tell our clients that they should include reporting as sort of as part of a service that they purchase from their suppliers, so that suppliers are sort of legally obligated to report. We've seen very often organizations who commit to sustainability objectives, and they ask their supply chain for that information, and the suppliers turn around and say, well, happy to report, but it's going to cost you however much extra, because we didn't factor that in our prices. So that contractual requirement is very important. And then finally, but probably most importantly, is using common language. So making sure that everyone is aligned with what information you're trying to obtain and what issue you're trying to address. By that I mean, if I ask or a supplier for their energy consumption, based on the supplier, they might interpret that in a slightly different way and provide different information. Some might provide kilowatt hours from their energy bill, but others might provide a bunch of different information, including their fuel consumption information, etc. So it's really trying to be really specific and making sure that everyone understands what it is you're trying to obtain from them when dealing with your supply chain is very important. And the way we do that with our clients is we get the supplier stakeholders together and we create common definitions that everyone agrees with and understands. Finally, in terms of that common language, also try to think that sometimes the information that you're asking from your supply chain will be reported by someone who's not necessarily competent in the area that we're asking them to report in. So make sure that you're using sort of relatively simple and understandable language, so it doesn't have any technical terms that someone might not understand. Here, this explores that in a little bit more detail, and it goes back to the planning quarter that I was discussing earlier on, and that's where I said that as an organization, when you're looking to manage performance, you first of all need to understand your strategy. And once you've done that, then you can break that down. This is really aligned to the approach that ISO 2400 proposes in their methodology. But it's first of all understanding your goals, right? Your overall aim. We can see in this example I've written, reduce the amount of waste being sent to landfill. And then as a result from that, you can then start drilling down and go down sort of how you break that up. So from that goal of reducing your waste sent to landfill, you can then set a target that 90% of your waste should be diverted from landfill, right? That's a tangible target that your organization or your supply chain can work against. And as a result, from that, you can develop what's known as an indicator, a KPI, right? So what is the percentage of waste diverted from landfill? And organizations can sort of, that's what they can report against, and then they can measure that indicator performance against the 90% target that's there. To get your indicator, to be able to calculate it, to know how much waste you diverted from landfill, you break that down into metrics, right? And there are two key pieces of information you need to know. First of all, you need to know, well, how much waste did you generate? And then how much of your waste was diverted from landfill, right? Was not sent to landfill. If you've got those two key pieces of information, those two metrics, you can then calculate your indicator and sort of move back up and see whether you're hitting your target, and therefore are you achieving your goal or not. So for every one of your objectives, we recommend that you break them down in this way. This is a simplified version of that. So if you look at the metric piece, then it can become much more complicated, right? Because that's where you then need to start breaking down that metric into, well, the waste, do I want to know my different types of waste, and is that being reported, and which organizations within my supply chain need to report against that, etc. This is the sort of the simplified framework for that. It's just at the metric level that becomes a little bit more complex. One key thing that we've developed is a visual indicator of whether organizations, whether our clients using this tool are hitting their targets or not. And here's a screenshot on the left-hand side of a dashboard for a project where you can see the different sustainability issues that a client wants to have an impact on. So air quality, community, employees, environmental management, ethics, materials, procurement, waste, and water. And what we can see is in green the areas whereby they're hitting their targets, and in red where they're not hitting them. In amber, it's where they're sort of almost hitting their targets, but they're not, so they're risk zones. But really what's key here is that the visual indicator enables our clients to very rapidly identify areas where they're not hitting their targets, and therefore where they need to take action. I'll just share another window from my computer. So I'm just sharing my web browser here. This is a dummy account in the sustainability tool, which is the reporting performance management software application that I implement with clients in the UK. What we can see here is I'm just showing a reporting interface. So in this instance, we can see at the top here that I'm in a report due page. So I've logged in as a waste contractor working on a Shoreditch project. Shoreditch is an area of London, for those that don't know. And then the client is Hepton Store Conversions. We can quite clearly see that I'm reporting for May the 1st to May the 31st. There's definite clarity in terms of, who I am and where I need to report. I'm a waste contractor, I'm reporting for those correct dates, etc. If we then go down here, we can see the list of information that I'm required to report as that supplier. Under carbon, I need to report number of vehicles, etc. And then I can see an I there with that common definition that I was talking about, the unit that the supplier needs to report against, and then the data, and then they can report it, and they can add comments as well. So you can see I've started reporting some of this. I'll fill in the next line here, gas or red diesel. I'll put 500 litres, and it shows me my carbon emissions, etc. as a result from that. If I submit that as a supplier, it then starts feeding into dashboards, right? Which is where the information is sort of analyzed. Here we can see an example dashboards with a few sustainability issues. And what I'll do is, as I open an issue, we'll then see the KPIs, right? So some of the indicators that we're using to measure how well we're doing against these issues. If I click on employees, we can see a few examples here against employees that organizations might want to use. So to know whether your employees are happy and satisfied and motivated, you're going to need to understand how you measure that as an organization. In this instance, this organization has decided to measure that with 3 key indicators. So one being percentage of work days lost to sick leave, percentage of BAME staff, so that's Black, African, and minority ethnic staff, and then total number of training in hours. 2 of these are in percentages. I would say that percentages are often a very good way of building a KPI, right? Because they're relative. And then one of them isn't. It's absolute. So to know, the total number of training in hours, my employees and my whole project. If I tell you 600 hours, well, you might not know whether that's good or not unless you know the context of that project. So typically we would advise clients to implement sort of relative indicators, relative KPIs, right? So it could be, percentage of training hours by total hours worked, right? So that, if I then tell you, well, it's 0.0001, you might tell me, well, that doesn't seem like a lot of training based on the amount of work that everyone's doing. Well, if I tell you, well, it's 5%, that seems like a much more reasonable number, and it gives you more of that context. Percentage of BAME staff, there to know that, you need 2 metrics. You need to know, what's your total number of staff, and then how many of them are BAME. So you can use the 2 to calculate that. And then percentage of work days lost to sick leave. Again, that's knowing how many days were worked in total on your project or by individuals in your supply chain, and then how many days were not worked because someone was ill, right? And again, that's a percentage. If I flick over to air quality, this is just by way of example. Here, the client has decided, this is a fictitious project, by the way. So when I say the client, it's a fictitious client. Here for air quality, the client, has decided to ensure that they minimize the pollution on air quality that they're creating. And the KPI that they've decided for that is percentage of vehicles that are 4 silver accredited. So essentially accredited to a certain standard of emissions. So there we go. So in that instance, they need to know, well, how many of their vehicles are accredited and how many of their vehicles do they have? And that's how they're able to measure that. This is in green, so straight away we know that client is doing well against air quality. Carbon, here there's a mix. We've got one example of an indicator is scope 1 emissions for the project. I won't go into it too much, but there's 3 different categories for your carbon emissions, and they fall into different scopes. So scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Scope 1 is any sort of emissions that you that would have been produced on site, like if you're burning a fuel on site, or if you have a company vehicle and you're driving that vehicle and that there's emissions coming out of its exhaust. Scope 2 is for all your energy that you're procuring from the grid, from your electricity provider. And then scope 3 is everything else. It's really, really broad. It's emissions that go into the travel for your goods and services, from if they're shipped by a logistics provider, or the carbon that's embedded in the materials you purchase, etc. So we can see here we've got these scope 1 as one indicator, scope 2 and scope 3, but then the client would have decided also, we want to know, well, what percentage of our CO2 emissions are from travel, right? Because that might be one of the ways they want to help themselves better manage their carbon impact. We can see here one with all project CO2 emissions, so that would be the addition of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and then CO2 emissions at the end from red diesel usage, because again, they might identify that as a hotspot, and they might want to know the absolute values of red diesel usage emissions that they're having.
Just one question here. I noticed on the slide there you have in red at the top left employees, and a question's come through. When you're doing this, are you tracking the labour audits to see whether there's modern slavery or non-payment of the minimum wage rate or any other issues, and to verify employer indicator data on the ground? We're being asked if you have a login for third-party verification or suppliers so they can declare whatever they like. So it's just a clarification, is the top left-hand symbol that says employees in red, are any of those issues included in that area?
Absolutely. So first of all, the dashboard that I'm presenting here is just an example of KPIs that an organization would have selected as appropriate, as relevant for themselves, for their organization, for their suppliers. And therefore, they might not have identified modern slavery as a risk that's particularly applicable to them, but it doesn't mean that other organization wouldn't, and therefore that can be included in this type of dashboard or in these types of reports that you as an organization might want to implement. Yes, typically we with organizations trying to ensure that they're minimizing their exposure to modern slavery risks. There are KPIs that can be built around that. It depends on your market, again, where you're based. In the UK, the organizations above a certain size have to publish a modern slavery statement, and therefore one sort of efficient way is that we ask suppliers who are working on a project, who are reporting, to identify whether they've published one of those statements or not, right? Because that's the first step in the right direction. So one KPI could be, well, how many of my supply chain has got a modern slavery statement, right, published? So that's sort of showing you their seriousness in relation to that requirement to publish modern slavery statements. It could also be, what percentage of your employees are, full-time employed, or are on part-time contracts, etc. If you're seeing that number is very low, then that might sort of raise flags for you. And you might think, well, I need to investigate to see, well, they haven't got full-time employees, so how do they have their employees, and what type of contracts do the staff have? And so that's prompting you to investigate, right? So through reporting, you might not necessarily get the final answer that you're looking for, but it will certainly help you to raise flags in high risk areas.
Okay, brilliant. A number of people have come back with the same question. How does Action Sustainability verify the information given by suppliers to make sure that it's reliable?
There are several ways that can be done. I'll try and answer as generically as possible, so it's not just Action Sustainability that's answering. But first of all, there's audits that can be carried out. So you get third-party organizations to come in and to carry out audits on your supply chain. As I said, we at Action Sustainability, we do provide that service, and when we do, we will sit down with our clients and analyze their supply chain and identify hotspots. We'll do a heat map to identify hotspots for risks, and we'll go and audit those suppliers first, and sort of those specific issues within those suppliers first, whether it's exposure to modern slavery. We'll go in and identify suppliers that employ lots of employees, employs lots of staff on sort of relatively low wage, and we'll go and really sort of investigate what their contracts look like, and what credentials do their staff have, etc. What are their processes for recruiting new staff, etc. The other thing is Data can be provided in several ways. It can be provided by a person, right, who can report data. But also data, thanks to technology, is being recorded automatically by systems. If you've got energy meters or water meters, you've got on many sites, whether it's an office or if it's a construction site or something, employees have swipe cards, right? So you know when they're coming in, when they're coming out, and as a result, and then you've got profiles you've got systems that keep profiles of your employees. So you can, through a system that's just recording this information automatically for you, you can get a number that gives you your percentage of hours worked by BAME staff this month, right? You don't need to record that information. So when you're relying on technology, typically it will become much more accurate, right? The information that you're provided is much more accurate. What we have in our tool is we have an approval process. So whenever data is provided by an organization, a supplier or someone in your projects, there is an individual who is responsible. It's typically a project manager or a site manager who's responsible for going and verifying the data and approving it. So it sort of gives that human element of someone who's got boots on the ground, who can view the data that's been submitted, right, and they can say, yes, we're happy with that. We'll all the data seems to be correct. There are no evident errors, and we'll report it. There are a few things that you can do to avoid data errors and to have that data assurance.
Okay, and there's just one last question, which was just going back to the previous question. Does the system stroke technology that we're talking about, allow third parties to log in and enter their data that would verify the supplier labour, safety, environment claims, and whether that data comes from tech audits or whatever? Is there a way of that happening?
Yes, third parties can have access to this system. I would encourage that any system that you use for your performance management and your sustainability reporting should enable your supply chain or third party organizations to be able to access it and have a sort of a role within that process of report, approve or review the data, and then analyze the data. In terms of having evidence documentation, etc., this is completely possible in this system. But whatever system you're using, you must make sure that the appropriate logs or contracts or any evidence documentation is readily available for you as an organization, because then that makes your audit processes and your verification processes much easier. Finally, there are ways that you can, it sort of comes back to the question before last as well, but there are ways when you receive data that you can see if you've got a sudden sharp increase in one of your indicators, and you can flag that up quite easily, just to ask a human being to go in and verify that data and verify the information that's been reported, because why is there a sudden spike in that information? Sometimes it's expected. It's because a certain activity wasn't happening and suddenly it is, so you're going from 0 to 100 from one month to the next. But there are definitely ways and processes that you can put in place to make sure you identify those early on, to see whether it's an issue with the data that's being reported, whether it's an issue with the evidence that's being gathered, etc.